Morning, everyone. It's so good to see all of you today. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. Welcome to the Forum Spring Season. Rhonda Magee is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, the inaugural director of the USF Law School Center for Contemplative Law and Ethics, and an internationally recognized mindfulness teacher and innovator. For more than 20 years, she has been exploring how mindfulness and other contemplative practices support engagement in the world in the face of the multiple interlocking challenges of our times, including systemic injustice, climate distress, political polarization, migration, war, and their effects on all of us. A prolific author, she draws on law and legal history to weave storytelling, poetry, analysis, and practices into inspiration for changing how we think, act, and live together in a rapidly changing world. Her book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness, which has been called brilliant and essential, offers a roadmap to a more peaceful world. So today we're talking about how inner work is essential in order to have the difficult conversations necessary for healing the conflicts that divide us. Rhonda, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
I enjoyed reading your book very much, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Yeah, me too.
I wonder, one of the things that you facilitated thousands of groups, and you know so much of what I want to know. But one of the questions you talked about that you ask different groups as they get together is, what race are you? And I thought, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you love about being the race that you are.
Such an interesting question. One of the things I love is just having, through my own experience of this body and the way in which the culture defines it through terms of race, right? Connects me with questions of identity, questions of meaning, purpose, heritage, lineage, through my own unique doorway, but then opens up a doorway to conversation with every human being about similar ideas and experiences. To me, it's race is just one of the many different kinds of concepts that we've created to help us navigate a world of difference and distinctive experience. And with all concepts, they are useful, can be quite helpful, can be enlivening on a certain level, and we can get stuck in them.
Yes.
So I think bringing some awareness to the both and of that, So the sort of part that is, again, an aspect that I celebrate has to do with, the very unique tradition of being a Black American, African American, that has in many ways inspired human rights and civil rights work across the globe, across centuries. Just this morning I was sort of reflecting on the role of the Black civil rights movement and the link between contemplative practice, which really probably has always existed. There's always been a link.
Yes.
But we don't often highlight so much the underlying contemplative practices that have supported civil rights work, for centuries. But there are different touchstones of that, and one that, again, is an example of the kind of aspect of what's called Black American history. Really, it's American history, really it's world human history, but it's a part of my own lineage experience that is the kind of example of what I celebrate and am proud of. Just looking at the 1917 NAACP silent protest march that happened to protest lynching, to protest anti-Black violence that was happening in the World War I era, happened in New York, helped make the case for the inherent dignity of Black folk that was constantly being challenged and has been challenged since enslavement, certainly in this country. And so they're, just remembering that, over 100 years ago, this sort of powerful silent protest took place and help inspire movements like that, help inspire, the sort of deep work of reconnecting with a sense of dignity that every human being, I think, is seeking in some level. So it's examples of what we call Black history that are part of what I celebrate about my lineage. And then, of course, as you know from the book, I talk about more personal aspects having to do with growing up in the South, growing up with a grandmother who was a Christian kind of contemplative, who would get up every day before dawn and pray, right?
I definitely resonated very deeply with that section about her prayer life and how it's still bearing fruit all these years later.
Absolutely.
Here's someone who's born, in 1906 was one of your grandparents.
Yes.
And she was probably born sometime around then. And her legacy of the things she learned in the early part of the 20th century is still being carried forward in your prayer practice, too.
Exactly. So that's another, a thing that I celebrate.
Yeah, I love that, because you really, all those conversations, all those facilitating all those workshops, it gives you a deeper sense of that history and how it plays out in ordinary people's lives.
Exactly.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what mindfulness is, and just like how you kind of came into your meditation and your different kinds of spiritual practices.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So, mindfulness is one of those things that, at least in the last, decade or so, has seemed to be almost everywhere all at once. And there's, in a certain sense, we kind of have received an understanding of what it is. But if you really look into it, there are many different ways people define it, express it. I take a lot of my inspiration from the traditions of Buddhism, actually, and the interpretations of Buddhism by people like Thich Nhat Hanh, who was, may he rest in peace and power.
Exactly.
He was very involved in, drawing on a deep, long practice of Buddhism for support in confronting injustice in the world, right? So offering mindfulness through the lens of social engagement was something that Thich Nhat Hanh, helped bring to the fore. And so I'm pointing to that particular kind of tradition as a foundation for how I interpret mindfulness. But on the other hand, one of my teachers and mentors in this work, Jon Kabat-Zinn, founder, if you will, of mindfulness-based stress reduction, white male from the Northeast, with a kind of a generational lineage of grandchild of immigrants and all of those sorts of things as well. But John has been very, I think, instrumental in giving us a definition that we can work with. And so he uses this definition of paying attention on purpose, with a kind of an attitude of friendly openness to what is here and what is arising. And that's very similar to Thich Nhat Hanh's definition, although Thich Nhat Hanh often underscores mindfulness as a part of a broad path of practice that has an a very important ethical foundation. So it's not just paying attention to what's happening on purpose with that attitude of friendly openness, but it's doing that in service of waking up and engaging in the world in ways that are constantly aiming as best we can at minimizing harm, at minimizing suffering, both within ourselves, interpersonally, and collectively. And so when I think of mindfulness, I'm certainly drawing on my friend and teacher John's very secular, portable definition. But for me personally, it's always had a deeper, it's always seemingly sort of rung a bell of an invitation that's much deeper than just sort of personal well-being or personal focus. It's always been about that, practices that can help me with that, starting with my own experience, but in service of healing and wholeness in myself, so that in some way, there can be a little bit more healing and wholeness in my interactions with others, and through that, perhaps, in the world.
Yeah, well, your ministry is extraordinary. I mean, anything that gives you the power to do what you do, I'm grateful for it. I wonder if you can tell about that, like the first time you ever meditated, like what instructions did people give you? What did it feel like? I remember I practice I have a daily meditation practice too. I remember where I sat, what the light was like in the wind. But what was it like for you, and how were you first exposed to it?
Such a great question too. So, I found these, as I mentioned, I had my grandmother as a sort of an inspiration when I started looking for something like meditation. I was at that time in my mid-20s. I just moved out to California from Virginia, where I've gone to law school and graduate school in sociology and undergrad. I mean, I did all these things and trained in all these different modalities for like leadership and success, including little known fact of training as a military officer, an Army officer. So I did Army ROTC, got my second lieutenant status. Like I did all these things.
Yeah, I read your CV. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it was sort of. And then I come out to California. I have a couple of months actually between taking the bar and starting my job. And I really realized I couldn't relax. Like I'd just been trained to do a lot of different things, but not to actually be at home in my body, to like notice my own mind going off in ways that sometimes were helpful, but weren't always helpful. And again, remembering my grandmother and the way that she would get up every day and have a very disciplined approach to her day that was inner directed, inspired me to look for something. And I was curious about other ways of expressing that, or manifesting those intentions beyond Christianity, but ways that might help me really notice what my own mind might be doing to waylay my whatever possibilities might be before me. And so as I was sort of bouncing off the walls of my apartment in Oakland at the time, waiting for my job to start, I found a book that my partner had. My partner, who also was about to start his first year as a lawyer, but whose family he had resources I didn't have. They'd gone off on a post-bar trip. His family's from India originally, so they were going back to India and traveling and doing this and that, and I was in the apartment in Oakland. But I found this book called The Bhagavad Gita for Daily Living.
Oh, yeah, of course, by Eknath Easwaran.
Exactly.
Yeah, so he's my friend and my teacher.
Is he?
Yeah,
well, that's beautiful to hear because he was my first friend and teacher through that book.
Yeah.
I didn't meet him, never had the pleasure of meeting him in person. But that book
he would have loved
really inspired me.
He would have loved what you're doing. He would have.
Wow.
He focused so much on young people to have this kind of effect.
Yes, he created this Blue Mountain Meditation Center in the East Bay. And so for me, it was just like, oh, wow, here is a book that describes a practice for, cultivating concentration, cultivating focus. I mean, he talked about one-pointed attention centering meditation.
Eightfold path.
Yeah. So I read that and was just like, all right, this sounds like, just to read it, it sounded like this in and of itself is centering. Just reading these words, what better, how much better might I feel if I actually try to practice it? So I started practicing it. So I was in a little apartment in Richmond, California at this point. We'd moved from Oakland, Richmond. And just explored on my own, meditating. I didn't have a guide at the time. I wasn't in a community. I wasn't in a public space. I was at home on a couch. Yeah. And I do remember feeling, wow, there's a way that we can kind of calm the mind in all of its, often embarrassing efforts to try to get ahead of whatever's happening and understand it and like judge things and like, interpret things. But there's a way that we can pause all of that and cultivate a way of being that can perhaps provide a little bit of space. Now I often think of the metaphor of mindfulness helping us at will be able to choose a way of almost having an eye in a storm. Because we're all kind of, there's a lot of storms happening right now. And so that ability to pause and create space within which to see things more clearly and to see our options for how we respond to things as opposed to automatically reacting. I got a little bit of a taste of that from that initial self-directed, self-guided meditation based on a book. But I think that's probably also one of the reasons why I felt like eventually I will want to, if there's anything that I'm developing that might be of service, I might want to write about it Because even though reading meditation is not as great as doing it, or is not as helpful sometimes as being with others meditating, it was a doorway for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, the examples that you use in the book, I can completely imagine you're in a class, there's 70 students, and someone says something very pointed about like undermining you as a person, as an authority, questioning you, like, I mean, or you're with a colleague, and the colleague, basically says the only reason you're here is because you're black.
Yes.
I can completely imagine. I mean, and I love the way you just portray the inner landscape of just like, I have a pause. I step back in my mind. I'm not going to react immediately. How do I mean,
I notice that there are options.
Exactly.
There are, and I mean, including, the full range is there. Noticing the emotions that are often driving the thoughts. We often are given to think that our mind is so rational, and emotions are always over here, and we can choose. But actually, mindfulness is a waking up to all of the different ways we get stuck, all of the different ways we are, all kind of afflicted in different ways.
Yeah.
And, helping us realize our capacity to discern a way of being with all of that, on balance, it's not about being perfect. It's not about, and it's also not about like pacifying ourselves and getting ourselves into this place where we don't do anything.
Right.
I'm a law professor. It's about doing things and being with people in service of something, right?
Yeah.
But it really has helped me with, sort of, kind of a long arc, which I feel like it's a lifelong invitation to sort of deepen our rootedness, our sense of our inherent belonging, our sense of the capacity we all have within us for again, healing, for a sense of wholeness, a sense of we already belong, or we wouldn't be here on the planet. Like, life has selected for us in a deep way. And, and we can, in any instance of challenge, feel the truth of that and resource ourselves beginning with just a simple breath, beginning with just simply feeling, the way in which these sort of soft-bellied, carbon-based beings are organic and are attuned in ways that are, again, often beyond our thinking brain's ability to see, attuned to ways of healing. Like, breath is a beginning.
Yeah.
And it's an opportunity to begin again, no matter what kind of trauma we face. I grew up in a household where there was, frankly, a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
So I speak about this from a place of knowing about suffering and knowing about the need for having these practices to support us.
How did you get from the Bhagavad Gita for daily living to like being more connected to like a community of people who were following these mindfulness practices?
And this is another good question and an interesting, feels a little bit like an unusual story because, I guess all of our paths are always 100% unique, right? And we sit down and listen to the details, it's always like, well, how in the world did it go from there to there? That's a unique way. But if we ask everybody that question, they all have that beautiful kind of differentiation that, makes for vibrant, diverse life experience through which we grow and learn. But for me, I, as I say, had started meditating right before I started my first law job.
Yeah, good timing.
So important. So then as I was this, one of the only young female lawyers in a law firm downtown San Francisco, yes, the only black lawyer in the firm, in the office of a big international firm that had about 70 attorneys in San Francisco. Yeah, the only black lawyer in the office.
Wow.
So there were a lot of ways that I felt I could draw on these practices to support me. Like, I already knew I had the skills. I already knew I had been trained to do this. Right. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy to go into a place that wasn't used to seeing people like me and didn't know necessarily how to treat me with a certain kind of respect and that as if I belong, even though I knew I did belong. I was, had proven myself in that way. So the practice was, from the beginning, something that I could lean into to support me in just working in that environment. But I was alone in it. And then, but I continued to explore meditation, journaling, yoga, different ways. I was a seeker in that sense. So I was doing my professional work and at the same time seeking. And I think that was in part because I had made so many leaps from like North Carolina and Virginia to San Francisco.
And then just from what your high school life was like to what University of Virginia was like.
Exactly.
And then, the
So
law
much
school
change.
after. Yeah, exactly.
And so I needed some support to kind of, it's like, and so many of us have versions of this, right? We immigrated, we migrated, we're straddling worlds.
Yeah.
So many of us. Even under the best of circumstances, we have these great opportunities, and we find ourselves, right, somewhat alone sometimes, right? And for me, these practices were a way of, like, again, an anchor. Yeah. And so as I was applying them in, doing the work as a lawyer, I found myself actually becoming a little clearer, because this is what the practices will do if you stay with them. They'll help us be more clear about who we are, what our values are, and, gaps between like what we're doing, how we are, and what we would want to do, how we want to be. For me, it's a constant waking up again to that ethical question of like, we have this one precious life. We know that no matter what, we don't get out of this alive. Right. So the question is, how do we want to live? Yeah. And what do we want to be doing with this day and this day? And so I was waking up to this sense that while being a lawyer wasn't, there were some great opportunities in that, it actually wasn't what I wanted to do most of my life. So I started looking for ways to go into education, found a job in teaching. Yeah. But along the way, started to explore how to bring mindfulness more into law. And it was in the course of that inquiry that I found a meditating lawyers group.
Oh, that's great.
That's what I mean. It's like it's unusual, right?
Yeah, no, it sounds perfect.
And it was like in 2003 or 4,
Great.
Right? When I found, so I was looking for, 2004, because I'd just gotten tenure at the law school, and I was wondering, is this all there is? Isn't there a way I can do because to get tenure, you have to do things sort of the way other people have done them. So then once you get it, you have a little bit more security to ask, is there a way that I could do it a little bit more in alignment with who I am? And I started looking for scholars who were interested in an inner dimension to law, inner work. And I found some. And then when meeting with these scholars who were writing, and, we'd have our article writing groups, study groups, I would often come to those groups and be curious about how do we practice in ways that support it. And so finally someone was like, I think you want to join the sitting lawyers. Like, you seem like you want to actually meditate. Right. We want to talk and write about it, but you want to meditate. So they helped me find. And it was a group of meditating lawyers in Berkeley, California, where all things like, enlightening seemed to, like Bhagavad Gita for daily living. Right, all these were grounded in Berkeley. That was the first, my first Sangha, if you will, meditation group. Exactly. And I'm still, affiliated with that group. That group is still, that small group of lawyers, it's never been more than 12 to 15 of us, kind of intentionally kept small, so we can get to know each other and stay in each other's lives over time. But that's been a deep and important part of it for me.
Yeah, that's great. And can you talk a little bit about just kind of like the Institute, just like how did that come into being? I mean, that's kind of like the last step in this.
Yeah, this center that I've been asked to reimagine, right? We had a Center for Ethics, so this is at the University of San Francisco, where I'm still fortunate to be teaching after many years now. It's shocking how many years. But just this past year, I have accepted an appointment to direct a Center for Contemplative Law and Ethics. Yeah. And we had a Center for Ethics at the law school, but I have sort of refocused it to center it on contemplative ways of knowing and of being, and of exploring what it means to bring ethics into the role of lawyering, into the work of being a lawyer, but really more broadly to create a space for really rethinking what ethics in application might look like through the lens of contemplative practice and contemplative ways of knowing and being. And I think one of the definitions I use for contemplation is one that's drawn out of, USF is a Jesuit university. So there's a Jesuit priest who gives a definition of contemplation that I also talk about in the book. It's Father Walter Burghardt, and he used this definition. Contemplation as a long, loving look at the real. A long and loving, but look at the real. What is going on? Yeah. And each of those aspects of the definition, I think, are important and inspire me and, help, in a way, ground me in this sense of what I'd love the center to do. So it's exploring ways of bringing a contemplative dimension to law, which is something I've been doing since 2004, since I started working with that group. I've been teaching a class called Contemplative Lawyering. Right, where we bring these practices in. Yeah. We look at the knowledge, skills, and values that comprise a traditional law school education. And we think about how practices for being able to pause, to notice how we're being triggered, how we are maybe being pulled out of what we know to be the professional values of lawyering or our personal values, and to kind of bring ourselves back into a place where we can choose how to act in ways that might minimize harm. Again, that ethical foundation that I think is at the core of contemplation and mindfulness, and then looking at how legal ethics might also be informed by these personal commitments to being more clear of who we are and to being more responsible, actually, for navigating a world in ways that minimize harm using the tools of lawyering. And, a big part of that for me is expanding the aperture on what we think about as ethics in law. In law, it's kind of an arid area. I have the support in the launching of this center. I'm supported by one of my colleagues, Matthew Liebman, a new professor of law there who teaches in our animal law program. He's the director of a wonderful program there because again, we're looking at not just human experience and the ways that we suffer in our embodiments, but really it's opening up that aperture on the connection between us and the more than human world. Our four-legged friends, the animal world, but also the planet. It's a recognition that, we're interrelating with all things, and our actions impact all those things. So I'm very fortunate to have Professor Liebman work with me, but he's also a professor of ethics. And I know from conversations with him, my own experience as a law professor, we think of ethics in law in a very rule-bound way, and almost like a minimum competency kind of way. Like if you pass a part of the bar exam, which has a professional responsibility piece of it, then you pass that somewhere when you were in your 20s. And your ongoing engagement as an ethical lawyer is something often really left to you to deal with on your own with not a lot of support. I think in this center, we want to invite thinking much more concretely about ethics as an invitation to think about how our actions impact actual human beings, how law and policy impact actual people, and to kind of interrogate the ways that we're often protected from reckoning with the consequences of law and policy. So interrogate how we get separated from communities who are harmed, and how the law, normalizes that, and really invites us to get to know the types of harms, really explore what suffering looks like from the real people, whether they're people who are being unfairly incarcerated, or people whose lives are being unfairly impacted by environmental injustice, or immigration policies, or policies that have disproportionate impact on women. Getting to know the real, actual lived experiences of people who are impacted by law and policy, and instantiating practices that keep us, as Brian Stevenson, author of Just Mercy, death penalty lawyer, who's another inspiration of mine, he talks about being proximate to those who are suffering. Right. And that's another touchstone for what I think the Center for Contemplative Law and Ethics can do. Reform what we think of the role of lawyers, as the role of lawyers, with a foundation in a commitment to contemplative practices or contemplative practices, and then deepen our courageous commitment to staying close to people who are suffering and to responding to that in ways that, Cornel West, Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about justice, again, in a way that we don't always talk about in law school, but as love in action, right? Justice as what love looks like in public. So I hope the center will help keep us honest about finding ways to get out of all of the legalese and right down to the question, how is this impacting people? Where is the opportunity to bring a more loving response to suffering into the world?
Yeah, I think it's so important, and I'm so glad that that the law school is being responsive to just changes in society and changes in the law. I think it's really forward thinking.
Yeah.
I want to talk about race today because I just feel like I feel like I have so much to learn from you in this department, and this is what I was looking forward to most.
Yes.
But I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about your own experiences growing up.
Yeah.
You and I are both exact contemporaries. We were born at the same time, so when you were a sophomore in high school, I was a sophomore in high school,
Yes.
and all the way down.
Where were you growing up?
And well, I lived in the East Coast when I was very young, and then I lived in California when I was in junior high school and high school. But I would love it if you could talk a little bit about just kind of what your experience of like television, media, what your home life was like. I mean, just how race looked, and how we would describe it to someone who was younger, who may not have been around then.
Well, so I grew up, as I talk about in the book a little bit, of course, in North Carolina and Virginia.
Yeah.
And I'll just name it for those who haven't read. Born in 1967. I often say the last year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life on the earth, on the planet.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of important touchstone, I think, for me. Because it's the late 60s and early 1970s when I'm first going into school, and I'm going into school in North Carolina. And so it's kind of post-civil rights, but in the dawning of this era we think of as the post-civil rights era.
Yeah.
But it's not as post as people might think, right? In the sense that when I started kindergarten in 1972 in North Carolina, in this little town called Kinston, where I was living then, the public schools, the public kindergartens had not been desegregated yet. And people think of Brown versus Board of Education, 54.
54, right.
Right. So years
54.
before, years had passed. And in 1972, so really a whole generation of kids had gone up in public schools. And there were still the same segregated public schools that had been in place at the time of Brown when I entered school. So I go to my school for black kids in that part of Kinston called Bynum Elementary School. And I have a picture, somewhere there's a picture of this little class. I don't know where it is. We lost a lot of things growing up because, again, trauma in the household. One of the things that goes first are photographs.
Yeah.
But I remember having seen a picture of that class, and it's all black kids. And then the first year, first grade, we move into a desegregated learning opportunity. And this begins a period where I and people in my age group in the South were often a part of busing efforts to intentionally desegregate.
And that was part of my experience going to public schools was busing and desegregation and affirmative action, which meant that I had a lot more interaction with people who were different than me than anybody who would have come if they'd been before 10 years earlier.
And probably many who come after.
After, I know. That was one of the saddest things. When UC Berkeley, the UC has stopped affirmative action.
And stopped desegregation before that, the efforts to desegregate really. So in a certain sense, our generation, we don't often enough recognize this, but was really not just the first generation to experience a kind of intentional effort to kind of organize our lives to support the kinds of engagement with the so-called other that would really help us move beyond some of our prejudices, move beyond some of the ways and the walls that separate us. It wasn't just the first, it was kind of the only, because the experiment around that was halted. And those of us in law can point to different cases and moments where we started as a society to pull back on some of those commitments toward desegregation and later affirmative action, or desegregation and affirmative action is two kind of twin projects that the law had been engaged in during our generation to really help support this, what I think of as like an effort to repair, right, a long delayed effort to repair some of the structural injuries that white supremacy and segregation and all the harms that are tied to racism and the structures of oppression tied to racism in our society, right? We have a long history of that, that has had long and deep legacies that we still are living with, that are still impacting our entire world, right? Including where neighborhoods are, right? Where wealth is, what communities, what our life expectancies are. Our entire culture has been formed in many ways, and I say deformed, by some of the legacies of the deep structures of separation, who belongs where, neighborhoods, wealth building, all of that. And, as I say, we came up in a time where, for at least a while, there was an intentional effort to do something about some of that. And that effort the commitment to really, address and call forth a remedy to match the Brown versus Board decision saying, separate and equal, right? The segregation regime that had been in place since Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the case that allowed segregation to become normalized in the post-Reconstruction, post-Civil War era, right? We have the Civil War. You think we're going to maybe, right, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that might reconstruct America. A lot of law scholars saw the Civil War, post-Civil War as like a new constitution has been formed, because we actually now have an equality doctrine coming out of the 14th Amendment that wasn't in the Constitution before the Civil War. We now have a commitment to ending slavery in the 13th Amendment that wasn't in the Constitution, right? We have the 15th Amendment saying, that there is a right to vote that should be available. All of this happens in the 19th century, and it gets shut down after Reconstruction because of Plessy versus Ferguson and other law that helped balkanize and normalize, again, this restoration of white supremacy, this kind of return to a way of keeping separate access to resources and opportunity in place by race. And so Brown versus Board disrupts, right? It comes to say that's not constitutional. That is not what we meant by the 14th Amendment. That's not what the promise of the Reconstruction period after the Civil War was meant to give us. But Brown versus Board of Education and all of its promise was also always contested, continues to be contested, right? So in a certain sense, we're still, unfortunately,
those are one of the questions I had, and I love this, and that you're so clear in this book about this, and that is, so racism evolves, and so
it kind of morphs, changes
like,
to be the new thing.
So what it was like in 1850 is different than what it was like in 1870, which is different than what it was like in 1890.
Different what it's like right now.
Yeah, exactly. 1975 versus 2025. Yeah. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like how, this is like the magic, like ball kind of thing, but how do you see racism evolving now as we're looking forward from this point? I think it's much easier to see those examples after they've happened, but what insight do you have in terms of just about what's happening with racism now? I just think of all the people on television talking about wokeness or people who are woke or what have you, but that might just be a distraction from what's really going on.
Well, isn't it interesting? And I'd be curious of those who in the audience who are listening here today in this moment and who will listen to later in a recorded form, would say from our vantage point, because as you know, I believe that mindfulness is inviting us, and these contemplative practices are inviting us always to come back to what we already know from our own experience. So it's often a temptation to look upon people like us, they will tell us how racism is evolving. Right. And in fact, we all know a lot, right?
Yeah. But we also know things that we don't know we know, the subconscious parts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, so just to say that one of the insights that I draw on in terms of linking mindfulness with this work of becoming more aware of what racism looks like today is to think about, the Buddhist teaching, for example, on what suffering is. It's greed, hatred, and delusion, and how different ways of attaching greed, different ways of resisting things that are attaching to something that's changing or attaching to things that are not permanent and resisting change, right? This in and of itself is one of the core ways that we suffer. And I often think about racism as a kind of racialized form of greed, hatred, and delusion. Right? We get so attached to a sense of me, my, and mine.
Yeah.
And then, applying that to, my people. And race is just one of the many ways that we can define my people as those who are entitled to something that your people aren't.
Yeah.
It's not only race as human beings, right? We look at religion as another vector where we can other, or gender, age. Again, as the sociology person in me knows, that we categorize as human beings, and race is just one. It's the one that we go. It's one of the go-tos in the U.S. But really, if you look around the world, the temptation to kind of categorize human beings and then rank order and then distribute resources based on all of that in uneven ways, that seems to be fairly universal. Yeah. But at the same time, the efforts to minimize the unfortunate aspects of that and the unequal or unfair consequences of those categories is also a constant. There's always people everywhere trying to say, right, there's a different way. We're all, one human family.
Exactly.
And so, I see racism, we can all see the temptation to revivify notions of who belongs and who doesn't, whether it's the rise in white nationalism, which is, kind of showing up these days in a new effort to normalize some pretty horrible sort of ideologies and worldviews. And when I say pretty horrible, I mean the most hateful ideologies and views that we've invented as a society are being kind of renewed and represented for us. Yeah. We see everything from just sort of debates about immigration and who should come and what are the consequences that have this racial tinge to it, if you will, that are racist, to swastikas again showing up in the protests at the Capitol. Yeah. Right. So we know that a renewed racist political discourse is a feature of our culture right now. It's not a bug. It's here. Yeah. And so we know this.
I think about this too so often. So there's like the big things that are happening. There's big demographic changes. I thought your book was helpful just to remind us that 77% of people in America are white. It's like, so why, one of the things that
in the Bay Area it often doesn't feel that way because it isn't so here. But broadly speaking, we're still a solidly, predominantly white country.
Yeah, exactly. So if every white person just voted for white people, then no one else would have a chance to lead. But one of the things that technology is another.
That's another way in which we see racism happening today.
Exactly.
The algorithms.
Exactly. The algorithms have it in them.
Well, they really are. There's a lot of wise writing about that. I'm not an expert on this, but I think all of us are at pains to pay attention to what's happening as the world we know is being remade by these beautiful monsters, our devices. Yeah. Because, and I call them beautiful in a way, they're the kind of beautiful monsters. We're all, we can't help. Most of us probably have a device, if not everybody in this room, some device within our fingertips somewhere. Mine is behind this curtain, my purse. But, we are more and more drawn into a way of being in the world that's almost completely, even the technologists say this, our attention, our way of being is being sort of colonized into technology as an interface. Yeah. And by colonized, it's almost like that's where all the attention, where all the money is, where the recognition is, and our young people are being raised in a sense to believe and feel that if they're not alive and present and seen in the tech world, they don't exist. Yeah. Right? Their lives don't matter unless it's being replicated or reinforced by likes and clicks and this and that. And the algorithms that run all of that draw on the information that's available in the world. Yeah. I was actually flying back from the East Coast just yesterday and happened to be sitting beside an executive at Facebook. I can't say his name. We didn't exchange names. You know how it is on these planes. Yeah, these deep conversations, you have no idea what you're talking about. Except you knew roles. And he was sharing just about, these algorithms and we're talking about the threats to really to humanity generally. But one of the things that he was pointing to is how, insofar as, for example, AI is just drawing on the information that's available, the information that's available doesn't privilege, for example, when we're having conversations about how to develop policy or corporate initiatives. Too seldom are there metrics for discerning what to do in the world that take into consideration how human beings will be impacted. Yeah. So if the computers, if the algorithms are just looking at what's out there, they won't get a lot of examples in the world.
There's going to be a lot less Rhonda Magee and a lot more,
it's just the money. It's just the short-term consequences, right?
Yeah.
And same is true, right? So the information out there is often organized around, privileging whiteness, privileging communities who have been identified as white. And so the algorithms are building in bias and putting it on steroids. Yeah. And this is a real and potent threat. So even to the degree that we're trying very consciously to upend this, perhaps those who are here, those who are interested in my work, we are already, again, we now have a new struggle fighting against that stream of the technology's bias that is that embeds sort of the racism that is within our culture in the technological universe that we're being embedded in now.
We have a tradition here at the Forum, so we take questions, written questions on cards, and it's a way for people, if they have questions, they can ask them too. So, one of my favorite parts of the book are all the stories. I mean, the story of your high school sweetheart. Yeah. I mean, I was so deeply moved by that story. Your boyfriend in high school was white, and his family just absolutely did not approve you.
But we were in the South. We were in Virginia.
Yeah, but the idea that they would throw their son out like garbage because of this idea that they had about
their
race.
Favorite son, right?
Yeah, exactly. But what I love is also the different times when you're talking about just the groups that you have. Sometimes there are groups that are mostly white, sometimes they're mostly people of color, all sorts of different contexts. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some just surprising things that you've learned in those groups, or surprising experiences that you've had in those conversations about race that are really revealing. They require a lot of that we like step out on faith, that that we are honest with ourselves. There's a lot of chance to have our feelings hurt when we're in a conversation like that.
That's true.
So I wonder if you can talk about some of the things that you've heard and learned.
Well, just, one thing, since the book has come out, 2019 is now 2023, as we're having this conversation, it's been an interesting journey because of some of the things we were talking about just a moment ago about how, frankly, white nationalism appeals to a kind of a new neo-racism, a kind of a newly bow-tied and Madison Avenue packaged white supremacy is sort of being, presented from the highest levels of our political culture and media. And now we've seen the attacks against the reckoning with racism that was coming into our culture during the George Floyd moment in 2020. And yes, there's going into this narrative about the perils or the terror that we should all feel because of something called critical race theory. Which,
oh my gosh, that's just so I'm just astonished by that.
Wokeness,
but
or whatever.
Isn't that so strange? I mean, I could never have predicted that.
Well.
I really couldn't. I mean, just like Mari Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, that their writing would all of a sudden be be dismissed without anybody even taking the chance to read it. I mean, it's Pat Williams.
But I mean, that's how racism is, I think, always
does. It just takes something and makes it a symbol of something that's hated.
It's all about a big lie, right? Racism, right? So the big lies that justified slavery.
Right.
That if you think about it, like for hundreds of years, there's all these big lies about people in bodies like this not really being human. Yeah. Full stop, a big lie. Yeah. But again, one that the whole culture sort of,
built its entire structure is completely around it, like where you live, what income you make.
And our ancestors, right, in this room, if they have a lineage that dates back to the era of slavery, were, lived in that. Yeah. And so this, we are often kind of struggling with the dynamics that would delude us, that would confuse us, right, into believing things that are really kind of not true. But we're seeing in our own lifetime how that can happen. You know, how a big lies about lots of different things can suddenly just be normalized against all facts.
Right, completely.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's been a very interesting period of waking up. Yeah. But what I'm seeing then is, back to your question about what's it like to go out there having these conversations, we're impacted by all these things. And so it's become harder in certain ways to have these conversations, especially in the last year. There's research that's coming out to show that the energy for conversations about race and reckoning with racism, that it kind of started to open up in 2020 after George Floyd's public murder, you know, that's fading. So you're having more and more people, and again, it's not an accident. It's the backlash is working, right? The sort of attacks that are supposedly on critical race theory and on, you know, wokeness, et cetera, are leading to, right, a disinvestment in conversations like this in corporations, at universities, in workplaces.
You're right.
So we are losing ground. And even to the degree we are still able to have these conversations at certain universities. For example, I was just at some universities this past week on the East Coast. The feeling in the rooms is different. There's a lot more of a sense of chilled, I'm not sure what I can say. And frankly, this isn't just on the East Coast or in the South. It's even true here in San Francisco. Even my own students have said to me this semester, you know, can we talk about X or Y, even though, you know, we're being told we can't talk about these things. So even when we are not saying it in our institutions, that is in the room now. Yeah,
you know, it's so funny because Pat Williams was on the forum like 2 months ago, but we're talking about censorship in the South. And yeah, I mean, censorship's happening there in that way, but you're right, it's even having an effect in any conversation you have anywhere.
Because that's what tyranny does.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what tyranny has always does, or whether we call it fascism. We sort of start to conform before we have to, and that's what we have to resist. Like, it's, you know, we start to, in a certain, often unconscious way, collude with the forces, right? Because we're just trying to survive and we're just trying to minimize, you know, blowback, and we're all suffering so much right now that we almost kind of don't want any extra distress.
Right, completely.
So we can understand, I have some compassion for what's happening, but what is happening is we are starting to conform before we have to. I've even had people say, well, do we want to call this here in San Francisco at my university, do we want to call this or that anti-racism? Because isn't that going to, you know, turn off maybe students who are coming from someplace where, right? Seriously. So we start to then conform before we have to. This is what we have to fight against.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a little section in there where you talk about Michelle Obama, and you're not critical. I love the way you handle it. But you say, you know, going high when others go low, that's not enough. Like that just being a person of upstanding character yourself isn't enough to undo racism.
Well, we try that. And even the Obamas keep trying that. And it's not that we don't try to kind of keep going high. But I think we also need to do what we can to, again, do something every day to demonstrate justice, to demonstrate a kind of a pushback against the forces that would silence us, the forces that would kind of, you know, reform us as separate and, you know, committed to, you know, sort of revivifying those hierarchies. And I mean, because again, those forces are alive and well, and it's a little bit of naivete that can come with wanting to do things in ways that minimize harm. And this runs through spiritual practice communities who are interested in this. There's a phrase called spiritual bypassing, which is about the temptation sometimes where we really love to look at our highest goals, and when we talk about race, we can get into a sense of division and pain and suffering, so we kind of want to avoid it. But we really have to, that's why we need the ability to cultivate that kind of like, no, we can do this. We can have hard conversations, and we can have them with love. And that's actually what I think we're trying to do.
So here's a great question from our audience. You speak to dignity often. What is your definition of dignity? And how do you observe dignity showing up in our lives as a whole? I love that question about dignity.
I love it too. So I've thought a lot about this concept of dignity over the years. I Yeah, it's partly because as a person who, is trained in law and teaches law, it's very clear that the notion, something called dignity, some notion that first of all, let me just say, whenever we use words, we're always, pointing towards something, some meaning that we're struggling to articulate. We're using a word as a placeholder for something. So what is the question I'm interpreting this question is, what is the word dignity? What is it holding the place of? Like that we feel as an aspiration for how we are with one another. And law, of course, is all about words, concepts, placeholders for all kinds of aspirations, and then creating a place where I hope nonviolently always we can contest what those placeholders mean. So dignity is one of those, and it has been a foundation for human rights law and discourse over the years. By the way, human rights law and discourse emerges in the post-World War II, post-Holocaust era in San Francisco. Some people know that, some people don't.
Right.
Where right here, we wrote the Declaration of Human Rights and promulgated that in the post-World War II era to help instantiate this idea of a universal right and entitlement to being treated with something called human dignity. So what is that? I think it's just this sort of respect and concern. Again, I'm going to use the L word, love, right? It's what a loving response to our humanity might call forth in how we are with each other. Yeah. This is kind of what I'm pointing toward, and I use the word dignity. And, my research has shown that the word dignity, of course, existed before World War II and before we had this idea of universal human rights. But it was often, like all our other concepts, like humanity itself, subject to hierarchical notions, right? So there wasn't like universal human dignity before the World War II human rights discourse started to promulgate it, right? And it was promulgating it in specific response to the racism of the Holocaust and the racism of humanity over generations that would divide and say some people were entitled to dignity, the full humans, and the others, whoever those others would be, wherever we are not entitled to dignity. Yeah. So there's something really beautiful about trying to articulate a concept that says we're all entitled to a kind of a loving response to our humanity, no matter what we look like, no matter what our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, right, our class. We're entitled to something.
Every person is
exactly.
a child of God.
So this is what I mean, and I think there's a call in that definition for each of us to attend to the ways that we might be failing, and we fail all the time. Yeah. You can drive through. I drove through San Francisco, or was driven through San Francisco to get here today. There are many ways, right here in this city, right, not far from this beautiful place, right? We're failing all the time. Yeah. When we don't provide sufficient housing in a world with, so many times over the wealth and capacity to enable housing sufficient for all human beings to live with that kind of dignity. We're failing when we don't provide adequate health care. We're failing when we don't provide, opportunities for all of us to make choices about our bodies that are consistent with the dictates of health and family needs. I mean, there are just many ways that we are failing, I think, to manifest the call to a loving response to the full humanity we see around us. And I hope, in everything that I do, to invite all of us to figure out, all right, where can I, right here, right now, I use this phrase, personal justice, to say that there's a part of justice that's just about how we are with each other and what am I doing today? Whether it's, am I, able to give eye contact to somebody that I'm, would otherwise dismiss because I'm being trained in wherever I get trained to ignore and to normalize the fact that people are sleeping on the streets. Can I start to kindle the sense of, the responsiveness, right, to the suffering I see? Because I think it's deadening and sort of becoming numb to suffering is one of the things that our culture is one of the ways that our culture, prepares all of us to serve the interest of those who would, ignore the call to dignity that I hope this work is reminding us to attend to.
There's one more question. It says, how does one in today's environment deal with the overwhelming social injustices and racial injustices in healthcare, criminal injustice, and I can't read that word. Personally, one can try to stay grounded, but as we go into the world, we're overwhelmed trying to make a change.
True.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's so true.
Yeah.
People are overwhelmed. Last week in one of my conversations at a university, a really nice university on the East Coast, one of the professors there broke down in tears, partly because no matter what our status and place, when we start actually having real conversations about how we are, we all know we're sort of a part of what John Kabat-Zinn in his most recent book so beautifully, he amplifies this phrase, the community of the afflicted.
Yeah.
Like, we all are afflicted in different ways by these circumstances that this question is pointing to. And it's kind of brutal how much we're up against right now. It's not, so I'm not trying to sugarcoat this moment that we're in. It's pretty overwhelming. And so if we're feeling overwhelmed, you're not alone. You're not alone, and it's justified because it's we are kind of in the storms have gathered, and they enter the storms of climate distress, of technological overwhelm, of income inequality, of all of those things. And, there's a particular flavor of it that I feel and that I'm encountering where we feel very isolated in our suffering. And it's partly, again, these devices. And we feel very much like it's hard for us to feel like our voices matter or our efforts matter. Again, partly because of the impacts of these devices. But it's not only that. Sort of a lot in our culture is going toward helping disconnect us from the sense that we can do anything.
Yeah.
And this is something that, this is how oppression always works, by the way. It always, works by making us feel like, well, there's nothing we can do but just kind of go along. And so everything that we can do to wake us up to the power of our, first of all, our being able to choose where to place our attention. That's why mindfulness is a superpower and why it is as one of the students who was at one of the events last week said, am I hearing you say that mindfulness itself can be part of the resistance? I'm like, okay, my work is done here. Yes, because choosing where to place our attention is maybe the first approximation to freedom and to waking up to oppression in this moment. Because again, the technological revolution is and combining with these forces of oppression to sort of manipulate our thinking and our attention so that we're always feeling distressed and we're always feeling outraged. Once we start choosing to place our attention in more life-affirming, more kind of restorative places, then we can together find the energy and the wherewithal to take the actions, to vote in ways that can, manifest the love that we feel, not the fear, right? In other words, we kind of need this sort of personal waking up to help us be able to manifest some sense that we're still alive together. And that together, often we can't do these things by ourselves. Nothing meaningful in terms of real change can be done by ourselves. But once we can reconnect to being alive together, which is a big part of what needs to heal, from there, all kinds of change can happen. It's that we are the biggest, I think one of the biggest things that mindfulness can help us do is reconnect with the power that each of us already has. We all have, even though we are not equally empowered. To be alive is to have power, to make a difference. And the right use of our power is something that I think we can cultivate, but we've got to first reconnect with our power and reconnect with a capacity to deploy power with other human beings who are struggling to instantiate dignity, for example, as opposed to power over. Because again, the narratives that run our culture are often about power over as opposed to power with. And to me, this is what we're inviting with this sort of engaged mindfulness.
Yeah, and I mean, I do look at these tremendous challenges that we're facing, but I mean, I look at the ministry that you're doing right on the ground with, just like that this weekend, as you just got back here. I just think of the students that you're encountering, the ordinary people that you're meeting, those conversations that you're facilitating. I mean, just the consciousness that you're raising for me. I mean, you're really one of my heroes out there on the front line, and those kinds of things really give me a lot of hope, because we're giving these challenges, and it's like a moment for heroes to be heroic, and you're definitely one of those people.
Well, and thank you so much for saying that. I feel the honor of that. But really, it's about knowing there's that hero in all of us.
Yeah.
And to really allow ourselves in whatever way. For me, it's been mindfulness, but really, it's whether we resonate with that particular term or those practices, whatever wakes us up.
Yeah, we have some heroes in this room right here.
We got to find that, right? I'm sure there are heroes right here.
Yeah, right here.
Right? But to touch into the hero within ourselves and the modality for waking ourselves up. I mean, Howard Thurman, a local hero, no longer obviously
completely.
Just a generation ago. Here, right? He created and founded the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. Yeah. He was one of Martin Luther King's teachers. He famously talked about how we really need to get in touch with what can wake us up to what is most alive in us, and to offer ourselves from that place. Because what the world needs is more people, more of us who are in touch with the hero in us, in touch with the life and the love within us, in the sort of justified, indignation. Wait, people are being left to their own devices and thrown on the streets and thrown in states of, disrepair and disregard because of addiction, because of... We can do better, and we can do better together. And that's what I hope these practices and this way of being can help us touch into, because we need this, right? We need the joy of being alive again.
Well, we are going to be online on Wednesday the 25th, and my guest will be the economist and sociologist Juliet Schor. In honor of Earth Day, we'll be talking about the intersection of climate change, the economy, and what it means to be a green consumer. You're welcome to join us at the 11 o'clock Eucharist service upstairs. We rely on your gifts of any size to the forum. There are many ways to give, including online at gracecathedral.org. And Rhonda, thank you again so much for being here and for your ministry out there in the world. We're very grateful for you.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.